Hello, tonight we're going to talk about medieval life, and more specifically, about the kind of pain that medieval people considered so ordinary, so unremarkable, so deeply woven into daily existence that they didn't even have a word for it. They just called it Tuesday. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always nice to imagine all of you scattered across the world, drifting off together. Now dim the lights, adjust your pillow, maybe pull the blanket a little higher, and let's ease slowly into a world where pain was not a problem to solve, but a companion to accept. Medieval people did not measure their days the way we do. They didn't wake up wondering if they'd slept well, because sleeping well was not a category that existed. They didn't ask themselves whether they felt rested, because rest was not something a body was expected to feel. Instead, they woke into a familiar arrangement of aches, stiffness, and quiet discomfort that had been there yesterday, would be there tomorrow, and had probably been there since childhood. If anything, the pain was a comforting sign. It meant the body was still working. It meant they were still alive. It meant the day could proceed. To understand medieval pain, you have to first let go of a very modern idea, the idea that pain is exceptional. Today we treat pain as an interruption, something that must be addressed, medicated, explained, or removed. In medieval times, pain was simply the background hum of being human. It was not surprising, it was not alarming, it was not even particularly interesting. It was just there, like weather or hunger, or the smell of smoke drifting in from the fire in the corner of the room. You did not fight it. You did not analyse it. You simply lived alongside it and adjusted your movements accordingly. Consider the moment of waking. A medieval peasant or labourer or noblewoman or monk opened their eyes not to sunlight, but to a grey dampness that had been waiting for them all night. The room was cold, always cold, because heat was expensive and firewood was work. Their body was stiff because the surface they had slept on was, to put it kindly, hostile. It might have been a straw mattress that had lost all shape and dignity years ago. It might have been a wooden bench softened only by a folded cloak. It might have been the floor, warmed slightly by the residual embers of a dying hearth. In any case, the first act of the morning was a slow, careful negotiation with a body that had spent the night stiffening in protest. They sat up gradually because sudden movement was for the very young or the very foolish. They rolled onto one shoulder, tested a knee, considered whether their lower back had forgiven them for yesterday's labour, and then, if the verdict was reasonable, they rose. Sometimes they stood immediately. Sometimes they paused at the edge of the bed for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the pain settle into its usual position. This was not weakness. This was strategy. A body used carelessly was a body that failed sooner. And a body that failed sooner meant a life that shortened faster. So medieval people learnt early to move with intention, to negotiate with their joints, to treat their spine like a difficult neighbour who had to be respected in exchange for cooperation. Once upright, the pain did not go away. It shifted. It relocated. It rearranged itself into a new pattern that was slightly more manageable than the one they had endured while horizontal. The shoulders eased a little. The lower back settled into a familiar dull throb. The knees announced themselves during the first few steps, and then quieted, having made their point. This was normal. This was expected. In fact, if a medieval person woke up without any pain at all, they might have found the experience unsettling. They might have wondered if they were coming down with a fever, or if they had been too idle the day before, or if some strange spirit had visited them in the night. Comfort. Real comfort. The kind we chase with mattresses and pillows and ergonomic chairs was so foreign to medieval life that its absence was not felt. Only its rare, suspicious presence would have been noticed. The medieval home did not help. Even for the relatively well-off, houses were draughty, damp, and cold for large parts of the year. Floors were often packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes that were changed less often than modern hygiene would recommend. Walls leaked air through every seam. Windows, when they existed, were small and unglazed, covered with wooden shutters or, in wealthier homes, thin sheets of animal horn or oiled cloth. The result was a domestic environment that constantly worked against the body. Cold seeped into joints, damp settled into lungs. Smoke from the central hearth stung the eyes and dried the throat. To live indoors was already a mild ongoing test of endurance. And this was considered fine. This was considered shelter. The bed itself, if we can generously call it that, was a project. For most people, it was a wooden frame filled with straw, or a straw sack laid on a bench, or a pile of blankets arranged directly on the floor near the fire. Wealthier households had proper mattresses stuffed with feathers or wool, and some even had curtains around their beds to trap warmth. But even in a nobleman's chamber, the mattress was lumpy, the linens were coarse by modern standards, and the temperature at night could drop severely. Sharing a bed with family members or servants was common, partly for warmth, partly because privacy was not a value that had been invented yet. You slept where there was space and warmth, and you were grateful for both. None of this was framed as suffering. It was framed as sleeping. It was framed as being at home. If someone had asked a medieval peasant whether their sleeping arrangement was comfortable, the question would have been strange. Comfort was not the point of a bed. The point of a bed was to keep you off the cold ground, to give you a few hours of unconsciousness, and to release you into the working day with your body more or less intact. That was the deal. That was the arrangement. Nothing more was expected. And so mornings unfolded slowly, quietly, and without ceremony. There was no coffee, because coffee had not yet made its long journey across the world. There was no shower, because bathing was rare, seasonal, and often communal. There was no toothbrush, though there were twigs and cloths and, for the ambitious, coarse pastes made from herbs and salt. There was no mirror in which to inspect the damage. There was only the pale grey light of dawn, the slow rekindling of the fire, and the immediate return to work. Whatever the body felt, work did not wait. Fields did not care about aching shoulders. Animals did not care about stiff knees. Children did not care that their mother had barely slept. The day began, and everyone rose to meet it, aching and unsurprised. What we sometimes forget, looking back through the softening lens of centuries, is that medieval people were not stoic because they were tougher than us. They were stoic because they had no other option. Stoicism was not a philosophy they chose. It was a survival adaptation they inherited. From the moment they were old enough to understand language, they were being trained, gently, quietly, sometimes harshly, to treat pain as unremarkable. A child who cried too long over a scraped knee was reminded that there was work to do. A child who complained of a stomachache was told to keep working and see if it passed. Most of the time, it did. Not because the pain was not real, but because the alternative, stopping, was worse. This is what modern people find hardest to imagine. Not the specific pains themselves, though those were plentiful, but the absence of the option to pause. In our world, we can stop. We can call in sick. We can take a day off. We can lie in bed and let the day pass without us. In the medieval world, that option barely existed. If you did not tend the fire, no one else would. If you did not milk the goat suffered, and so did you. If you did not harvest before the rain came, you starved. Pain was not a signal to rest. Pain was a signal to keep moving carefully, and so people did. By the time you reach the end of this journey through medieval pain, you may find yourself, quite involuntarily, developing a strange gratitude for the small comforts of your own life. The soft mattress beneath you. The warm blanket. The lack of a mysterious ache in your jaw that has been there since childhood. The fact that you can stretch your arms above your head without your shoulder filing a formal complaint. These are not trivial things. They are luxuries that would have astonished a medieval person. Luxuries that most of human history did not include. So as we drift together through the various pains that medieval people considered totally fine, Let yourself notice how far removed you are from that world, and how gently your own body, whatever it feels tonight, is being held by comparison. Because tonight, we are only just beginning. We have not yet touched the fields, the frozen mornings, the winter that never really ended, the bones that healed wrong, or the teeth that hurt for decades. We have not yet met the medieval body in full. We are only, so far, waking up. Now that we have gently opened our eyes into the medieval morning, let us stay in that first slow hour a little longer, because there is much still to notice. The moment of rising was only the beginning of a long, quiet series of adjustments that medieval people made before the working day even truly started. Getting out of bed was not the hardest part. Getting dressed was where the real negotiations began. Clothing in the medieval world was not designed for comfort. It was designed for coverage, warmth, and durability in that order. For most people, the wardrobe was small, sometimes consisting of a single set of everyday garments and perhaps one better set reserved for church or festivals. These clothes were worn for years, patched repeatedly, and adapted to fit changing bodies. They were made from wool for warmth, linen for the layers closest to the skin, and occasionally leather for outerwear or reinforcement. Cotton was rare in most of Europe until much later. Silk was for the wealthy. Everyone else wore what the sheep, the flax fields, and the family loom could provide. The fabric itself was not soft. Wool was coarse, sometimes scratchy, often stiff before it had been broken in through years of use. Linen was better against the skin, but medieval linen was not the smooth, refined material we know today. It was rough, uneven, and prone to irritation, especially in warm weather when sweat glued it to the body. Undergarments existed, but they were simple. A long linen shirt for men, a linen chemise for women, worn beneath everything else and changed as often as circumstances allowed, which was often not very often at all. That single layer stood between the body and the heavier outer wool, and it was the closest thing medieval people had to a soft embrace throughout the day. Getting dressed in winter was an entirely different experience than getting dressed in summer, and both had their own particular discomforts. In winter, the clothes were cold. If they had been left out overnight, which they usually were, they had absorbed the temperature of the room, which was somewhere between chilly and genuinely freezing. Putting on a cold wool tunic was an act of quiet courage. The fabric pressed against the skin like a damp cloth, and the body flinched involuntarily as it made contact. Layers helped. So did dressing quickly near the fire, if there was one, or wrapping oneself in whatever blanket was closest until the clothes warmed to body temperature. Nobody enjoyed this. Everybody did it anyway. In summer, the problem reversed. The heavy wool that had felt so necessary in January now clung to the skin, trapping heat and sweat in equal measure. Medieval people did not have the luxury of a summer wardrobe and a winter wardrobe. They had a wardrobe, singular, and they wore it year-round with only minor adjustments. In hot weather, they removed layers when possible, rolled up sleeves, opened necklines, and tried to work in the shade. But the fundamental materials remained heavy, insulating, and unforgiving. Heat exhaustion was common. Rashes were common. Skin infections in the folds of the body where sweat pooled were common. And yet, complaining about the heat was seen as unproductive, because the sun did not care and the work still needed doing. Shoes deserve their own moment of quiet consideration. For those who had them, medieval shoes were a marvel of practicality and a small ongoing tragedy of foot health. They were made from leather, usually a single piece stitched together to form a soft, flexible upper attached to a thin, hard sole. There was no arch support. There was no cushioning. There was often no distinction between left and right, meaning the shoes gradually moulded themselves to whichever foot happened to be wearing them that week. They provided a barrier between the foot and the ground, and that was about all they promised. Walking in these shoes on medieval roads was an experience that would have modern feet begging for mercy within an hour. The roads themselves were another form of adversary. Paved roads existed in cities and along old Roman routes, but most people walked on packed dirt that turned to mud in the rain, froze into painful ridges in winter, and baked into hard, uneven surfaces in summer. Small stones worked their way inside shoes constantly. Splinters, thorns, and sharp bits of debris found their way to the sole. Blisters formed within days of a new pair of shoes and reformed constantly as the shoes aged. And when the shoes wore out, as they inevitably did, people patched them, cobbled them together, and kept walking. A truly footwear-free existence was more common than we imagine, especially among children and the very poor. Bare feet meant tougher soles, but also more cuts, more infections, and more accidents. And yet, none of this stopped anyone. Medieval people walked everywhere. They walked to the fields, to the well, to the market, to the church, to the neighbouring village. They walked on pilgrimage sometimes for weeks or months at a time. They walked in every weather. They walked with heavy loads on their backs, buckets balanced on yokes across their shoulders, or children clinging to their sides. Their feet ached constantly. Their calves developed the kind of quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of unbroken movement. Their ankles rolled sometimes on uneven ground, and they simply rolled them back and kept going. If a foot problem became severe enough to actually stop them, that was considered a crisis. Anything short of that was just walking. Now, once dressed and shoed, or perhaps still barefoot depending on the season and the household, the medieval person stepped out into the morning. And here we meet the next layer of pain that medieval people considered totally normal, which is the sheer physical assault of medieval weather. The air outside was, for large parts of the year, actively hostile. In winter, stepping outside meant walking into a wall of cold that sank immediately through wool, linen and skin, straight into the bone. In summer, it meant walking into a heavy heat with no shade for miles across the fields. In autumn, it meant damp air that soaked through everything and clung. In spring, it meant mud. So much mud. Endless mud that pulled at boots and legs and slowed every step. Weather in the medieval world was not a topic of pleasant small talk. It was a daily physical presence that had to be endured. Cold especially deserves attention because it did more than just make people uncomfortable. It reshaped medieval life. It determined what could be done and when. It dictated how food was stored, how animals were sheltered, how families arranged their sleeping bodies at night. And it caused pain that had no proper name because it was too constant to be worth naming. There was the sharp pain of freezing air hitting the face during outdoor work. There was the throbbing pain of hands that had been exposed too long without gloves, gloves being a luxury that many did not have. There was the deep aching pain of joints that had chilled slowly over hours and would not warm up again until the person was very close to a fire, and even then only reluctantly. There was the particular misery of returning indoors to a house that was only slightly warmer than the outside, and finding that your fingers, which had been numb, now burned as circulation returned. All of this was simply winter. Even the children knew these pains, especially the children. Medieval childhood, contrary to romantic imagination, was not a time of soft protection from the world. Children worked. Small children gathered kindling, tended chickens, watched over younger siblings, and helped with countless small tasks that used their tiny hands productively. They stood in the cold. They walked barefoot in the mud. They developed the same aches, the same calluses, the same weathered practicality as their parents, only earlier and with less complaint permitted. A crying child was a normal child, but a child who cried about the cold or the work was gently, firmly, or sometimes harshly reminded that this was life. And so children learned, very young, that pain was not a signal to run home. Pain was a signal to keep going and hope no one noticed. There were of course some who had it easier. The wealthy had warmer clothing, better shoes, fires that stayed lit longer, and servants to do the coldest, wettest, most miserable of the outdoor tasks. But even nobles were not spared entirely. Their castles were often colder than peasant cottages because the stone walls held the chill relentlessly. Their beds were softer, but their halls were cavernous and draughty. Their fine woolen robes were heavier and better made, but they still had to travel, and travelling in the medieval world meant hours on horseback in weather that punished both rider and animal. Wealth softened medieval pain, it never eliminated it. Even kings woke with aching joints. Even queens felt the cold seep through their layers. The distribution of misery was uneven, but the presence of misery was universal. There is something quietly humbling about all of this, if you sit with it long enough. We tend to think of history as a long line of people trying to escape discomfort and slowly succeeding, and there is truth in that. But medieval people were not simply enduring bad conditions and waiting for better ones. They were living inside a version of the human experience that did not include the expectation of comfort at all. They did not know they were missing anything, because there was nothing to miss. Their pain was not a lack. It was a texture. It was the fabric of ordinary life, woven so tightly into every hour that it disappeared into the background. And so, dressed in scratchy wool, wearing shoes that would horrify a modern podiatrist, stepping out into weather that would send a modern person straight back to bed, the medieval person began their day. They did not sigh dramatically. They did not curse the cold. They simply pulled their cloak a little tighter, adjusted their tools, and began walking toward whatever work waited for them. The pain came with them. It always did. And they would carry it, patient and unremarkable, into the long working hours ahead. The working day in the medieval world did not begin with a plan. It began with a set of tasks that had been the same for as long as anyone could remember. Tasks so deeply embedded into the rhythm of survival that they required no discussion, no scheduling, no motivation. The body simply moved toward them because it had been moving toward them since childhood. And with every task came its own particular flavour of physical strain, its own small contribution to the growing catalogue of pains that medieval people considered totally, completely, unremarkably fine. Let us begin where most medieval days began, which was with water. Water had to be fetched. It did not arrive through pipes. It did not sit patiently in a tap waiting to be summoned. It lived at the bottom of a well, or in a stream, or in a village fountain, and someone had to go get it. That someone was usually a woman or a child, and the task was performed multiple times a day, every day, for a lifetime. The buckets were wooden, heavy even when empty, and heavier still when full. A single bucket of water weighed enough to strain a small back. 2 buckets balanced on a yoke across the shoulders weighed enough to leave permanent marks on the skin, permanent grooves in the posture, and permanent aches in the neck and spine. The walk to the water source was rarely short. In villages fortunate enough to have a central well, it might only be a few hundred paces. In more scattered settlements, it could be a walk of 10 or 15 minutes each way, often uphill on the return journey, because water sources tended to be in low ground, while houses were built slightly higher for drainage. The path was uneven. The buckets sloshed and splashed no matter how carefully they were carried. Cold water spilled onto legs in winter, soaking through wool and adding a fresh layer of chill to the ongoing battle against the cold. And this journey happened not once, but many times a day. Water was needed for drinking, for cooking, for washing what little was washed, for the animals, for the garden. A medieval household consumed astonishing amounts of water once you added it all up, and every drop of it had been carried on someone's aching shoulders. The women who did this work developed bodies that reflected it. Their shoulders became slightly rounded from years of carrying yokes. Their arms grew wiry and strong in specific patterns, particular muscles overdeveloped, others neglected. Their hands became rough, calloused, and prone to cracking in the cold, and their backs, especially their lower backs, carried the accumulated wear of thousands of trips to the well. By the time a woman reached her 30s, she moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned exactly which motions hurt least. This was not old age. This was simply being an adult woman who had done her share of the work. Firewood was the next great task, and it was often considered even more demanding than water. Fires burned constantly in medieval households, not for luxury but for survival. The central hearth cooked the food, warmed the room, dried wet clothes, and provided the only meaningful light after sunset. Letting the fire die was a small domestic crisis. Restarting it required flint, patience, dry kindling, and time, all of which were in shorter supply than modern people can easily imagine. So the fire was tended constantly, and constantly required feeding, and every stick that fed it had to be gathered, carried, and often chopped. Gathering firewood was a task that fell to almost everyone at some point. Children collected small sticks and dead branches. Adults hauled larger logs, sometimes from significant distances, especially in regions where nearby forests had been picked clean over generations. The tools were simple: an axe if the household could afford one, a hatchet for smaller work, and often just bare hands snapping branches from dead trees. Splinters were constant, cuts from sharp branches were constant. The occasional serious injury from a slipping axe or a falling log was accepted as an unfortunate but predictable part of the work. Lower back strained, shoulders burned. Hands blistered and eventually hardened into a leathery resilience that could grip rough wood without complaint. Then came the carrying. Firewood was heavy, awkward, and often had to be transported over long distances. People carried bundles on their backs, secured with rope or leather straps that dug into the shoulders and cut into the skin. They balanced logs across shoulders that were already sore from yesterday's carrying. They dragged larger pieces along the ground when their strength gave out. And they did this in every kind of weather, because a household without wood was a household without warmth, and a household without warmth in winter was a household courting death. So the wood came home, always, no matter how the body protested. Once inside, the wood still demanded labour. It had to be chopped into usable pieces. It had to be stacked to dry, because green wood smoked terribly and burned poorly. It had to be sorted into kindling, medium pieces, and larger logs for sustained burning. All of this involved bending, lifting, swinging, and stacking, motions that added their own small contributions to the medieval body's long-running conversation with pain. A tired shoulder from chopping wood on a Tuesday would still be tired on Wednesday, and would need to chop wood again on Wednesday anyway, because the fire did not pause for recovery. The garden and the fields were the next arena of daily labour, and here the medieval body encountered work that shaped it more thoroughly than perhaps any other. Agricultural labour was not seasonal in the sense that we might imagine. There was never a moment when the land simply took care of itself. Every season brought its own demands. Spring meant ploughing, sowing, and preparing soil that had hardened over winter. Summer meant weeding, watering, tending, and constant vigilance against pests, birds, and diseases. Autumn meant harvest, which was the most brutal season of all, weeks of dawn to dusk labour bringing in grain, fruit, and vegetables before rain or frost could ruin them. Winter meant slightly less field work, but more animal care, more repair of tools and buildings, and more inside work like threshing and grinding that had its own physical costs. Ploughing was perhaps the most physically punishing single task in the medieval world. It required walking behind an ox or a horse, sometimes for hours at a stretch, holding a heavy wooden plough steady as it cut through resistant soil. The plough bucked and jolted whenever it hit a rock or a root, which was constantly, and the ploughman had to wrestle it back into position while continuing to guide the animal forward. His arms burned, his shoulders ached, his hands gripped the plough handles until his fingers cramped. His feet, in their thin leather shoes, slipped in the freshly turned earth and stumbled over the uneven ground. And at the end of a long day of ploughing, his back was so locked into a bent position that straightening up became a slow, careful process that could take several minutes and involved audible protests from every joint along the spine. Sowing was gentler in some ways, but demanded its own toll. Walking up and down the rows with a bag of seed slung across the body, scattering by hand in a rhythmic sweeping motion that had to be even, consistent, and efficient. It looked graceful from a distance. Up close it was tedious, repetitive labour that strained the arm and shoulder in exactly one direction, over and over, until the muscles ached in a specific pattern that would return every sowing season for the rest of the person's life. Farmers developed favoured sides, dominant motions, and small compensatory habits that kept them working through the discomfort. Weeding was worse in its own quiet way. It required hours of bent labour, either fully crouched or on hands and knees, moving slowly through the fields to remove unwanted growth by hand or with small hook tools. Knees suffered enormously. Hips locked into strange positions. The lower back reached levels of protest that would send a modern person to a chiropractor, and simply had to be endured. Women and children did much of this work because it was considered less prestigious than ploughing or scything, but it was just as physically demanding in its own patient, grinding way. Harvest time was when medieval bodies were pushed to their absolute limits. The grain had to come in quickly, before weather could destroy it, and every able body in the village worked from first light until the sun set, and often past that, with only short breaks for food and water. Scythes swung in long rhythmic arcs, cutting through stalks that then had to be gathered, bundled and stacked. The motion of scything was one of the most efficient movements ever developed by human labour, but it was also unforgiving. It engaged the entire body in a twisting, pulling motion that left every muscle involved fatigued at the end of the day. Blisters formed on hands that had held tools for hours, shoulders locked up. Lower backs developed a peculiar, deep ache that lingered for weeks after harvest ended. And still nobody stopped. Nobody could stop. If the grain was not brought in, the village went hungry that winter. So they worked through the pain, through the exhaustion, through the injuries. They wrapped bleeding hands in cloth and kept scything. They wrapped strained ankles and kept walking. They rubbed liniments made from herbs and animal fat into aching muscles at night and got up before dawn to do it all again. Harvest was measured not in days, but in weeks of relentless physical output, and by the end of it, every adult in the village looked visibly worn down. Faces were thinner, postures were more bent, movements were slower. And this was considered normal. This was considered a good harvest, because the alternative, an unfinished harvest, was famine. After the fields came the animals, and the animals never rested. This is one of the great overlooked truths of medieval life. Even on days when human beings might have wished for a moment of stillness, the animals demanded their care with the same unrelenting insistence as hunger itself. Cows needed milking twice a day, morning and evening, at times so consistent that a missed milking caused pain to the animal and lost milk for the household. Sheep needed watching, feeding, and, in certain seasons, shearing. Pigs needed slop, chickens needed grain, and horses, if the household was wealthy enough to have one, needed grooming, feeding, and constant attention to their hooves and their harnesses. Animals were the medieval household's living infrastructure, and infrastructure requires maintenance. Milking a cow was an exercise in patience, technique, and quiet endurance. It was done sitting on a low stool, leaning against the warm flank of the animal, with the head pressed into her side, and the hands working in a rhythmic, alternating squeeze that drew milk into a wooden bucket held between the knees. The position was cramped, the hands cramped even faster. Within minutes, the fingers began to ache from the repetitive grip, and by the end of a session, they were stiff and slow to open. The lower back complained from the bent posture. The neck ached from being turned to one side, and the cow, patient though she generally was, sometimes shifted her weight, sometimes kicked at flies, sometimes swished her tail directly into the face of the person milking her, adding small annoyances to the accumulating discomfort. All of this happened twice a day, every day, for years. The women and older children who did most of the milking developed hand strength that would have shamed modern athletes, along with a chronic finger stiffness that they simply accepted as part of having useful hands. Feeding the animals meant more carrying, more bending, more lifting. Buckets of slop for the pigs, armfuls of hay for the cattle, grain scattered for the chickens, water hauled from the same well that supplied the humans. The pigs in particular deserved a special place in the medieval catalogue of daily labour. They were kept because they turned scraps into meat with remarkable efficiency. But they were also large, strong, opinionated animals who did not always cooperate with the humans responsible for them. Cleaning a pigsty was one of the most unpleasant tasks in medieval life, involving mud, waste, smell, and the constant risk of being knocked over by an enthusiastic pig who did not appreciate the disturbance. Backs ached from shoveling, legs ached from wading through mud. And the smell, well, the smell was something medieval people learned to simply not notice, because noticing it would have made every day intolerable. Shearing sheep was seasonal but memorable. It required wrestling the animal into position, holding it still against its considerable protests, and then working large iron shears across its body to remove the fleece in one continuous piece if possible. The work was hot, exhausting, and dangerous in small ways. The shears were sharp. The sheep were strong. Cuts on the hands were common. Kicks to the legs and body were common. And by the end of a shearing day, the person doing the work had a lower back that felt permanently bent and forearms that trembled with fatigue. The wool then had to be cleaned, carded, spun, and eventually woven, each of these tasks generating its own small chorus of aches, particularly in the shoulders, wrists, and eyes of the women who did most of the textile work by the poor light of small windows and evening fires. Speaking of textile work, let us pause here for a moment, because it deserves proper attention. Cloth in the medieval world did not appear. It was made laboriously by hand, from raw fibre all the way through to the finished garment. The process began with washing and combing the wool or preparing the flax. It continued with carding, which used two boards covered in small spikes to align the fibres, a task that made the wrists ache within minutes. Then came spinning, which turned the prepared fibres into thread, using either a drop spindle or, in later medieval periods, a spinning wheel. Spinning was a task women did constantly, in every spare moment, often while doing other things like watching children or listening to conversation. It looked easy. It was not. Hours of spinning left the wrists sore, the shoulders tight, and the eyes strained from watching the fine thread form. Then came weaving, done on wooden looms that ranged from small hand looms to large floor looms in more established households. Weaving demanded coordination between hands and feet, patience for hours of repetitive motion, and a strong back to sit upright throughout the work. Weavers developed particular patterns of muscle fatigue, tension in the shoulders from throwing the shuttle, aches in the lower back from the seated posture, and the peculiar exhaustion of eyes that had focused on fine work for too long. And after weaving came sewing, another endless task, done by hand with needles made of bone or metal, thread that had to be carefully prepared, and light that was often insufficient. Women squinted at their work by candlelight in the evenings, straining their vision year after year, until by their 40s or 50s, many could no longer see well enough to do fine work at all. This gradual blinding through repetitive close work was so common that nobody thought of it as unusual. It was just what happened to eyes over a lifetime. Now, if the outdoor and household labour gave medieval bodies their broader aches, the small, close, repetitive tasks gave them their more specific ones. Hands were the great victims of medieval work. Hands did everything. They milked, wove, cooked, chopped, hauled, wrote, kneaded, stitched, cleaned, dug and endured. And they paid for it. Medieval hands, by the time they belonged to a middle-aged person, were rough, weathered, often scarred, sometimes missing a fingertip or a joint from an accident that had not healed cleanly. Nails were chipped and dirty in a way that no amount of washing could ever quite resolve. Cuts appeared constantly and healed slowly, and while they healed they had to keep working, because work did not pause for a bandaged finger. Cooking, which we tend to associate with warmth and pleasant smells, was in medieval terms a hot, smoky, physically demanding activity that took hours every day. Meals had to be prepared from raw ingredients that had themselves been produced, gathered, or preserved through significant effort. Bread was a staple, and bread meant baking, and baking meant kneading, which meant hours of pushing, folding, and turning heavy dough with tired arms and floury hands. It meant tending an oven, which was often a communal village oven, meaning the bread had to be carried there and back, and it meant watching the fire carefully, because a burned loaf was a genuine loss to the household economy. Stews and pottages, which formed the backbone of medieval meals for most people, required constant stirring over open flames. Standing over a fire for long periods burned the eyes with smoke, dried out the skin of the face and hands, and created a specific kind of full-body fatigue that came from heat exposure combined with the constant need to remain attentive. Turning meat on a spit, if meat was available, was a task often given to children, who developed forearms of surprising strength from hours of slowly rotating a heavy skewer while trying not to get too close to the flames. Burns were common. Small burns, big burns, burns from splashing hot liquids, burns from touching a metal pot handle, burns from a spark that jumped from the fire. Everyone had burn scars. Everyone. And nobody thought this was worth remarking on, unless the burn was serious enough to actually prevent work. Grinding grain into flour was another endless task, one that in earlier medieval periods was done at home using two large stones. One rotated slowly over the other, while grain was fed into the space between. This was a task performed by women, standing or kneeling, pushing the upper stone in a circular motion for what felt like hours. It engaged the shoulders, the arms, and the lower back in a repetitive strain pattern that produced a very specific soreness. Even after the invention of watermills and windmills made larger-scale grinding more efficient, home grinding continued for many households, especially in rural areas. The women who did this work often had asymmetrical development in their arms and shoulders. One side visibly stronger than the other, one side more prone to pain. Preserving food for winter added another layer of exhausting seasonal labour. Meat had to be salted, smoked or dried, each method requiring hours of careful work. Vegetables had to be pickled or stored in cool cellars where they were checked regularly for rot. Fruit had to be dried, laid out on cloths and turned periodically, protected from insects and animals. Cheese had to be made, which was itself a lengthy process involving heating milk, adding rennet, waiting, cutting the curds, pressing, and then aging for weeks or months. All of this happened while all the other daily labour continued. There was no dedicated preservation day. There were only days on which preservation was added to everything else that already had to be done. Now take a moment to consider the accumulated effect of all this on a single body. Every day was a combination of long walks in poor shoes, heavy carrying, awkward bending, repetitive small motions, prolonged standing, prolonged kneeling, exposure to weather, exposure to smoke, small burns, small cuts, and steady muscular fatigue. Every day, from childhood onward. Without a single day of true rest, because even on Sundays, when religious observance forbade certain kinds of work, the animals still needed feeding, the fire still needed tending, and meals still had to be prepared. Sunday was a day of less work, not no work, and even that lighter Sunday still involved walking to church, standing through long services, and returning home to whatever household tasks could not be avoided. By the time a medieval body reached what we would now call middle age, meaning perhaps 35 or 40, it carried inside it the physical record of every one of those thousands of days. Joints had worn down in specific patterns dictated by specific tasks. Muscles had developed unevenly. Postures had adjusted around old injuries. Small, chronic pains had settled into permanent residence. And this was considered, quite genuinely, a healthy adult body. This was not decline. This was maturity. This was what a body looked like when it had been useful for a couple of decades. Now that we have wandered through the daily labour of medieval life, let us turn to something more intimate, more constant, and in many ways more quietly unbearable than any single task. Let us turn to the mouth. Because if there was one region of the medieval body that generated pain on an almost continuous basis, it was the mouth, and specifically the teeth. Tooth pain in the medieval world was not an occasional event. It was a lifelong companion, and one that most people learnt to live with in ways that would astonish anyone who has ever taken an aspirin for a simple ache. Let us begin gently, because this is the kind of pain that deserves a slow and careful telling. Medieval people did not brush their teeth in any way that we would recognise as effective. There were attempts, of course. Cloths were rubbed against the teeth to remove obvious debris. Twigs from certain trees, particularly those with slightly aromatic bark, were chewed until they frayed into rough brushes. Some people used mixtures of herbs and coarse salt as a kind of primitive tooth powder, and the wealthy might have had access to more elaborate preparations involving crushed shells or ground pumice, which cleaned teeth by essentially sanding them down. None of this was very effective by modern standards. Most medieval mouths carried a steady accumulation of food debris, bacterial growth, and slowly worsening dental damage that no one really understood how to prevent. The diet did not help. Bread, the staple food of nearly every social class, was often coarse, gritty, and full of small fragments of stone that had entered the flour during milling. The millstones themselves wore down slowly over time, releasing tiny particles of rock into every loaf. Medieval teeth chewed this bread 3 times a day, every day, for a lifetime, and the effect on the enamel was steady and devastating. Teeth were literally worn down by the food that kept people alive. By the time a person reached their 30s, their molars were often flattened, their edges chipped, and their bite noticeably shorter than it had been in youth. This was not a pathology. This was the normal aging of a medieval mouth. Beyond the wear, there was the decay. Medieval people did not have refined sugar in the quantities we do today, but they had enough. Honey was the great sweetener of the medieval world, used in cooking, in medicines, in special treats. Fruits, especially in preserved forms, provided sugars that clung to teeth and fed the bacteria that caused cavities. Wealthier households had access to imported sweets, expensive spices, and elaborate desserts that were harder on teeth than any peasant fare. It is a small irony of history that the wealthy often had worse teeth than the poor, because they consumed more sugar and could afford the sticky sweet delicacies that peasants could not. Cavities formed slowly, often over years, and once they formed, there was very little anyone could do. Toothaches began quietly, a slight sensitivity to cold water, a twinge when chewing on one side, a dull ache in the jaw at the end of a long day. Medieval people ignored these early signs because there was nothing to be done about them, and drawing attention to them would not help. So they simply started chewing on the other side, or avoiding certain foods, or holding warm cloths against the jaw at night. This worked, in the sense that it delayed the crisis. It did not stop the underlying decay. Eventually, the pain graduated from a whisper to something louder. The tooth would begin to throb, sometimes constantly, sometimes only at night, sometimes in response to specific triggers that the person had learned to identify and avoid. Cold air on the exposed nerve produced a sharp jolt of pain that could bring even a strong adult to a halt for a moment. Hot food could produce similar reactions. Even a strong wind against the face could set off a tooth that had reached a certain stage of decay. And so people learned to breathe carefully through slightly closed mouths in cold weather, to blow on their food before eating it, to angle themselves away from draughts, to sleep on the side that did not press on the aching jaw. These were not conscious strategies. They were adaptations that developed naturally over years of living with pain. The worst stage came when the decay reached the nerve or when infection set in. This produced pain of an intensity that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. It was the kind of pain that took over the entire face, radiating out from the tooth into the jaw, the ear, the temple, and sometimes down into the neck. It was the kind of pain that made sleep impossible, that pulsed with the heartbeat, that seemed to have its own personality and its own agenda. Medieval people endured this pain sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, because there was no effective way to stop it. There was only the hope that eventually the tooth would die completely, the nerve would deaden, and the pain would subside into a duller background ache. There were treatments, technically, The medieval pharmacy for tooth pain was extensive, though its effectiveness was limited. Cloves were pressed against the aching tooth, and cloves actually contained a mild anaesthetic compound that provided real, if temporary, relief. Certain herbs were chewed or held in the mouth. Warm poultices were applied to the outside of the jaw. Prayers were offered to saints associated with dental suffering, particularly Saint Apollonia, whose martyrdom involved her teeth being knocked out, and who became the patron saint of anyone facing dental agony. People made pilgrimages, wore small medallions, whispered specific prayers, all in the hope that spiritual intervention might succeed where herbs had failed. Sometimes the pain subsided on its own, and this was often credited to the prayers. Sometimes it did not. When the pain became truly unbearable, extraction was the last option. And extraction in the medieval world was not the calm, sterile procedure we know today. It was performed by barbers, blacksmiths, travelling tooth drawers, or occasionally by physicians, using tools that ranged from simple metal pliers to elaborate hooked implements designed to grip and pull. Anesthesia, in any meaningful sense, did not exist. The patient was given wine or ale to dull the mind. Perhaps a strong friend held their shoulders. Perhaps a piece of leather was placed between the remaining teeth to bite down on. And then the extraction began. Sometimes the tooth came out cleanly, in a single pull. This was considered a great success, and everyone involved was relieved. More often, the tooth shattered under the pressure of the pliers, leaving pieces embedded in the gum that had to be pulled out one by one, each extraction reigniting the pain in fresh, creative ways. The jaw could be dislocated by the force, neighbouring teeth could be damaged, bleeding could be significant, and infection afterward was a serious risk. People sometimes died from tooth extractions, either from immediate complications or from the infections that followed. Everyone knew this. Everyone had the extraction done anyway when the pain became bad enough, because living with the pain was worse than the risk of dying. Missing teeth were therefore entirely normal by adulthood. By middle age, most people had several gaps in their mouths, along with worn stumps and teeth that had gone dark from internal decay. A full, healthy smile in a medieval adult was so rare that it was noticeable, often noted in descriptions of remarkable individuals as a sign of unusual health or divine favour. For everyone else, the mouth was a place of gaps, of tenderness, of careful chewing on the sides that still worked, of avoiding certain textures and temperatures. Meals were negotiated with the mouth. People developed favourite foods based not on taste, but on what their teeth could still manage. Soft bread soaked in broth, well-cooked porridges, stews with the meat cooked down to shreds. These were the meals of adults who had learned that hard, cold, sharp or chewy foods were sources of pain waiting to happen. There was also the matter of breath. Medieval people were fully aware that mouths smelled bad. They tried to freshen their breath with herbs, with rinses made from wine or vinegar, with chewing on fragrant leaves. But given the state of their teeth, their gums, and the general absence of effective oral hygiene, breath was, on average, quite bad by our standards. Nobody remarked on this because everyone was in the same situation. It was simply what mouths smelled like. Kissing, close conversation, sharing cups, all happened within a general olfactory environment that we would find challenging. Medieval people did not find it challenging because they had never known anything else. And then there were the gums. Gum disease was widespread, though nobody would have called it that. What people knew was that their gums bled easily when they chewed hard bread, that their gums were sometimes swollen and sore, that certain teeth felt loose in their sockets in ways that seemed to worsen over time, that occasionally, without dramatic pain, a tooth would simply fall out on its own, leaving a small bloody socket that healed over the course of a week or two. This was not shocking. This was a body doing what bodies did. The medieval mouth was in a state of slow, ongoing decline from about the age of 15 onward, and this decline was accepted as part of aging in exactly the way we now accept greying hair. What is perhaps most striking about medieval dental pain is how it was integrated into personality. People developed characteristic ways of holding their faces to protect a sensitive tooth. They developed particular expressions, particular ways of speaking, particular preferences in food that others simply learned about them. A person known for eating slowly, or for turning their head to one side when biting, or for avoiding cold drinks, was not thought of as sickly. They were just themselves, adjusted around their mouth. Pain shaped identity in small, constant, invisible ways. It became part of the texture of who each person was. And through all of this, work continued. Nobody stopped working because of a toothache, no matter how severe. The fields still needed tending, the animals still needed feeding, the children still needed watching. So people worked with hands pressed to their jaws, with cheeks swollen from infection, with dulled eyes from sleepless pain-filled nights. They worked, and they endured, and they said nothing, because saying something would not help. And the pain over months and years taught them something modern people have largely forgotten. It taught them that a body can hurt continuously, and life can still somehow continue. Let us leave the mouth now, gently, and turn our attention to another part of the medieval body that suffered in ways that were considered entirely unremarkable. Let us turn to the stomach. Because if teeth were the source of medieval sharp pain, the stomach was the source of medieval quiet pain, the kind that hummed constantly in the background of every hour of every day. Hunger was not an occasional guest in medieval life. Hunger was a resident. Hunger lived inside the body from childhood to old age, and most people spent their entire lives learning to ignore it. To understand medieval hunger, you have to first release the modern idea of appetite. In our world, hunger is a signal that leads to a meal, and the meal resolves it. We eat when we are hungry, and we stop when we are full, and the entire cycle happens multiple times a day with reliable predictability. In the medieval world, this cycle was broken at both ends. Hunger did not lead reliably to a meal, because meals were determined by season, harvest, and household resources rather than by desire. And fullness, that comfortable, satisfied feeling of having eaten enough, was so rare that most people did not know it as a regular sensation. They knew hunger. They knew less hunger. They rarely knew the absence of hunger. Meals in the medieval world were smaller, less frequent, and more monotonous than modern people can easily imagine. For most peasants, the day included 2 meals, a light one in the morning and a larger one in the afternoon or evening. The morning meal might be a piece of coarse bread with a small amount of cheese or butter, perhaps a cup of watered ale or thin soup. The afternoon meal was usually a pottage, which was a thick stew or porridge made from grains, vegetables, and whatever else was available, sometimes with small amounts of meat or fat added for flavour and calories. That was the day. That was what fueled hours of hard physical labour. Bread was the great backbone of medieval eating. It provided the bulk of calories for most people, and it came in many varieties, though few of them were what we would call pleasant. The bread of peasants was made from a mixture of grains, often including rye, barley and oats along with wheat, and sometimes stretched with beans, peas or acorns in lean years. It was dense, dark and heavy. It required serious chewing, which was difficult given the state of medieval teeth. It sat heavily in the stomach and released its calories slowly, which was actually beneficial for people doing hard physical work, but it did not produce the satisfying pleasure that modern soft breads offer. It fueled the body without delighting it, and this was considered exactly what bread was supposed to do. The wealthy ate whiter bread, made from more refined wheat flour, and this bread was considered a mark of status. To eat white bread was to eat prosperity. To eat dark bread was to eat labour. But even the wealthy ate less bread than we might imagine, because they had access to other foods, and even they experienced the constant medieval reality that meals were events with clear beginnings and endings, and between meals there was often nothing to eat at all. Snacking, in the modern sense of eating small amounts throughout the day, was largely a fiction. Food was too scarce and too structured for casual grazing. When you were between meals, you were hungry, and you simply worked through it. Vegetables varied by season and region. Cabbages, onions, leeks, garlic, turnips, parsnips, carrots that were often purple or white rather than the orange we know, beans, peas, and various herbs formed the backbone of the medieval garden. These vegetables were eaten in stews, in soups, in porridges, and sometimes raw when nothing else was available. They provided fibre and some vitamins, but they were also filling in a way that could feel deceptive. A stomach full of cabbage did not stay full for long. Within a couple of hours, hunger returned, and the person went back to work with an empty middle and a body that continued burning through calories at a rate the diet could barely support. Meat was the great sometimes food of the medieval world. Peasants ate meat rarely, perhaps a few times a month if they were lucky, more often on feast days or at slaughter time in autumn when livestock were killed and preserved for winter. Chickens, pigs, sheep, geese, and occasionally beef entered the peasant table, but often in small portions, cooked into stews to stretch the flavour across many servings. Wealthier households ate more meat, and the very wealthy ate elaborate meat dishes at nearly every major meal. But even for the wealthy, fresh meat was seasonal. For most of the year, meat meant salted meat, dried meat, or smoked meat, all of which had strong preserved flavours that took getting used to and provided calories more than pleasure. Fish was significant, especially in religious contexts. The church prescribed many fast days throughout the year, days on which meat could not be eaten, and fish filled the gap. Coastal communities ate fresh fish. Inland communities ate salted or dried fish, particularly cod and herring, which had strong flavours and required soaking before cooking. Fish was accepted as an alternative to meat, but rarely inspired the same enthusiasm. Dairy was important where available. Milk, butter, and cheese provided fats and proteins that were hard to get elsewhere. But milk did not keep well, so it was quickly turned into cheese, which could be aged and stored. Cheese was often hard, sharp, and heavily salted for preservation, and it was eaten in small quantities as a supplement rather than as a meal in itself. Butter was similarly used sparingly. And then there were the drinks. Water in the medieval world was often unsafe to drink directly, especially in towns where wells could be contaminated by proximity to waste. So people drank ale, wine, or cider, depending on the region. This was not because medieval people loved being drunk. Everyday ale was very weak, brewed to be drunk in large quantities without significant intoxication, and it provided calories, hydration, and a small amount of nutrition. It was the water of the medieval world. Children drank it. Nursing mothers drank it. Everyone drank it, all day, in modest amounts, as part of ordinary life. Now here is the point where hunger enters the story properly. Because even with all of this eating, medieval people were, for the most part, chronically underfed by modern standards. Their diet provided enough calories to survive and to work, but rarely enough to feel satisfied. Their stomachs learned to accept a permanent state of gentle emptiness. The hollow feeling in the middle of the body became so familiar that it stopped registering as pain in the way it does for us. It became just a sensation, like temperature or tiredness. Present, noticeable, but not remarkable. Children grew up with this feeling. They knew hunger before they knew how to describe it. They played with hunger sitting in their bellies. They worked with hunger following them into the fields. They fell asleep with hunger settling into their bones. And they woke up with hunger already waiting for them, patient and unmoved. This was not neglect. Their parents were feeding them everything they could. It was simply that the medieval food system, for most people, could not produce enough to leave anyone truly full. The consequences of this chronic mild hunger were significant, though medieval people did not always recognise them as consequences. Growth was slower. Adult heights were shorter than they became in later centuries when nutrition improved. Bones were more fragile because they had not developed with adequate calcium and protein. Immune systems were weaker because malnutrition made it harder to fight off infections. Wounds healed more slowly. Pregnancies were more dangerous. Recovery from illness was longer. All of this was accepted as simply how bodies worked, because nobody had a comparison group of well-fed people to notice the difference. And then there were the truly bad years. Because on top of this baseline of quiet hunger, Medieval life included regular periods of serious food shortage. A poor harvest could turn a hungry village into a starving one. A crop disease could destroy months of work in a single week. A late frost could kill young plants. A too wet summer could rot the grain in the fields. A too dry summer could shrivel it before it ripened. Wars could bring soldiers who took what little food villages had. Taxes could take what wars had left. And in any given year, some combination of these disasters could turn ordinary hunger into genuine famine. Famine years were remembered for generations. Old people told stories to their grandchildren about the winter when the flour ran out in February and the village survived on boiled acorns, tree bark, and the last of the saltfish. They spoke of years when neighbours died of starvation slowly over weeks, growing thinner and quieter until they simply stopped. They described the strange calm of extreme hunger, the way the body eventually stopped complaining and simply began shutting down. Medieval people knew what real starvation looked like because they had seen it, often multiple times in a lifetime, and this knowledge shaped their relationship with food in ways that persisted through the good years. Waste was not just impractical in the medieval world, it was a kind of moral offence. Throwing away food was almost unthinkable. Bread that had gone stale was soaked in soup or broken into puddings. Meat that was past its prime was heavily spiced and cooked long enough to be safe. Bones were boiled repeatedly to extract every trace of flavour and nutrition. Vegetable scraps that we would throw in a compost bin were fed to animals or used in stocks. Nothing edible was discarded. To waste food was to insult the labour that had produced it and to tempt the hunger that was never far away. The physical effects of this hunger on the body were quietly cumulative. Weakness after skipped meals, lightheadedness during heavy work, slower thinking after a lean stretch, muscle loss during winter when food was scarce, and underneath all of this, a stomach that ached. Sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, in ways that people learned to notice without being alarmed. The rumbling was familiar. The hollow was familiar. Even the cramping when it came was familiar enough not to require explanation. Everyone's stomach did this. Everyone's stomach had always done this. This was just what stomachs were. And so medieval people worked hungry, walked hungry, prayed hungry, and slept hungry, and considered themselves normal. Let us drift now from the stomach to the joints, because the medieval body carried its aches most permanently in the places where bone met bone. The joints of medieval people were where the physical record of their labour was written most clearly, and where pain settled most permanently, and where the small, quiet compromises of everyday life became visible in the way a person walked, reached, bent, or turned. If you had been able to observe a group of medieval adults simply moving through a village square, you would have seen a symphony of accommodations. This one favouring a right knee, that one holding a shoulder slightly higher than the other, another turning the whole body when they needed to look sideways because the neck no longer rotated cleanly. None of this was considered old age. This was ordinary adulthood, written in stiffness and adaptation. Joint pain in the medieval world began earlier than modern people would expect. Children who worked hard from a young age, and nearly all medieval children did, developed the beginnings of joint wear before they reached adolescence. Wrists that had already carried too many buckets, knees that had already spent too many hours on cold, hard ground, backs that had already learned to bend under weights that were too heavy for growing bodies. This was not seen as damage, it was seen as strength. A child whose body had already begun to adapt to labour was considered a useful child, a valuable child, a child who was becoming a proper adult. The aches that came with this early adaptation were not treated as warning signs. They were treated as evidence that the child was being raised properly. By adolescence, most medieval bodies had developed characteristic patterns of joint use and joint strain. A young man who worked in the fields had shoulders and forearms already thickened from swinging tools, along with early signs of wear in the specific joints that his particular tasks stressed most. A young woman who spent hours spinning, milking, weaving and hauling water had wrists that ached in the mornings, shoulders that felt tight by evening, and lower backs that had already learnt the postures of adult labour. These were not injuries. These were adjustments. Bodies were responding to their environment in the only way bodies know how, by remodelling themselves around the demands placed upon them. The knees deserve particular attention because they suffered so much. Medieval work required an astonishing amount of kneeling. Prayers were said on the knees, sometimes for long periods. Weeding was done on the knees. Scrubbing floors, when floors were scrubbed at all, was done on the knees. Milking was often done on a low stool that essentially forced the knees into a deeply bent position for extended periods. Gardening, harvesting root vegetables, tending small plants, mending nets, cleaning fish, all of these tasks and countless others required people to spend significant portions of their day with their knees pressed against hard surfaces. Over time, this created wear that manifested as pain in cold weather, stiffness in the mornings, and swelling after particularly demanding days. Rising from the kneeling position was itself a small daily performance. A young child could bounce up from the ground without a thought. A young adult could rise smoothly, using the strength of the thighs. A middle-aged person needed a hand on something solid, a wall, a bench, a knee itself, to push upward against gravity. And an older person, meaning perhaps someone in their 40s or 50s, might need to rock forward, gather momentum, and rise in a series of stages, pausing halfway to let the knees adjust to their new position. All of this was normal. All of this was expected. Nobody looked twice at a person who took a moment to stand up after prayer. Everyone understood. The hips followed a similar trajectory. Medieval walking, medieval standing, medieval carrying of heavy loads over long distances, all of these placed enormous demands on the hip joints. Women who carried children on their hips developed asymmetries that lasted for life. Men who carried grain sacks on one shoulder developed hip pain on the corresponding side. The uneven ground of medieval roads and fields meant that every step engaged the hips in slightly different ways, adjusting constantly for surfaces that were never level for long. This constant micro-adjustment was invisible but relentless, and over years it wore down the cartilage in ways that produced deep, aching pain, particularly in cold or damp weather. Cold and damp deserve their own moment here, because they were, for medieval people, the great enemies of joint comfort. In winter, joints hurt more. This was known. This was expected. The specific mechanism was mysterious, but the reality was universal. A back that ached mildly in summer might ache severely in January. A knee that felt fine in July might refuse to bend properly in November. People adapted by wearing extra layers over their most painful joints, by wrapping wool around their knees when possible, by sitting close to fires in the evenings and letting the warmth ease the accumulated stiffness of the day. But indoors, even beside a fire, the medieval home was cold enough that joints rarely fully relaxed during the winter months. Pain lived with people from October to April in ways that made spring feel like a physical liberation. The wrists were another quiet story. Medieval hands did so much that the wrists were rarely at rest. Milking, spinning, kneading, chopping, sewing, writing for those who wrote, weaving, grinding, and endless small tasks all demanded specific wrist motions that, over years, produced characteristic pain patterns. What we now recognise as repetitive strain injuries and carpal tunnel syndrome were widespread among medieval workers, though of course they had no names for these conditions. What people knew was that their wrists ached, that certain motions had become painful, that gripping objects sometimes felt weaker than it used to, and that in the mornings. Opening and closing the hands often required several minutes of gentle motion before they worked properly. The shoulders bore their share of the burden too. Any task that involved reaching, lifting, or carrying overhead engaged the shoulders in ways that gradually damaged them. Roofers, who repaired thatch by reaching upward for hours, developed shoulders that ached constantly. Women who hung laundry to dry, who stretched to reach high shelves, who lifted children onto their hips repeatedly, developed shoulder pain that limited their range of motion long before they would have thought of themselves as old. Rotator cuffs, though nobody knew that name, tore silently and healed imperfectly. Muscles compensated, movements adjusted, and people continued working, adapting the way they used their arms so that the least painful motions became the most habitual. Now in modern life, when a joint begins to hurt persistently, we have options. We can rest it. We can consult professionals. We can take medications. We can adjust our activities to protect it. Medieval people had almost none of these options. Rest was rarely possible. Professional medical care was expensive, unreliable, and often more dangerous than the ailment it treated. Medications existed, but were limited to herbal preparations that offered mild relief at best. And adjusting activities meant, in most cases, doing less work, which meant less food, which meant more suffering elsewhere. So people simply endured. They kept working. They kept moving, and the joint pain became part of who they were. There were, however, some strategies. Heat was the great medieval remedy. Warm cloths pressed against aching joints, sitting close to fires, bathing when possible, though bathing was rare, in warm water. Poultices made from herbs and warmed on the hearth before being applied to painful areas. All of these provided real, if temporary, relief. Massage was practiced, sometimes by family members, sometimes by folk healers who travelled between villages. Certain herbs were known to reduce pain, particularly willow bark, which contained compounds related to modern aspirin, though nobody knew why it worked. It just did. Sometimes. Prayer was another significant strategy. Medieval people believed deeply in the intercession of saints, and specific saints were associated with specific ailments. A person with knee pain might pray to a saint known for helping with joint suffering. Pilgrimages were undertaken to holy sites known for healing, sometimes involving journeys of many weeks that were themselves physically punishing, but that offered the hope of relief upon arrival. The relief that came from these pilgrimages was sometimes attributed to divine intervention, and sometimes, we might suspect, to the placebo effect that comes from believing so strongly in the possibility of healing. Either way, the pain was addressed, even when it was not truly cured. Bloodletting, that great medieval treatment for nearly everything, was also applied to joint pain. The theory was that pain in a joint was caused by an imbalance of humours, the four fluids that medieval medicine believed governed health, and that draining a small amount of blood from a nearby vein could restore balance. The practice was widespread and generally unhelpful, though it did create a brief period of light-headed distraction that could feel like improvement. Modern medicine would find bloodletting horrifying. Medieval patients often welcomed it, because they believed it might help, and they were willing to try nearly anything. By middle age, most medieval people had developed a personal geography of pain. They knew which joints hurt most in cold weather. They knew which movements caused the worst flare-ups. They knew how long the morning stiffness typically lasted, how many hours of work their bodies could sustain before pain became severe, and how to modify their tasks to keep working without collapsing. This knowledge was not written down. It was accumulated through years of observation and adaptation, and it was passed on informally through comments and demonstrations, rather than through any organised teaching. Older people showed younger people how to move to protect their joints, how to lift without straining, how to sit and stand in ways that eased the accumulating aches. Medieval life was in this sense a long, quiet apprenticeship in living with pain, and through it all, work continued. The medieval body, aching and adjusted, kept doing what needed to be done. It ploughed with a bent back, it milked with stiff fingers, it carried water on shoulders that would never again feel light. It knelt in prayer with knees that protested, and when the day ended, it lowered itself carefully onto its straw mattress, and it slept, and it woke, and it did it all again. Let us turn now to something we have circled around but not yet fully faced, which is medieval illness. Because if the joints told the slow story of medieval wear, illness told the sharper, more unpredictable story of medieval crisis. Sickness in the medieval world was not what it is today. It was not something you fought with medications and rest and expected to recover from within a predictable time frame. It was something you entered, sometimes without warning, and you did not always know if you would come out again. And in the meantime, you kept working, because the alternative, stopping, was often more dangerous than the illness itself. To understand medieval illness, you have to first release the modern expectation that most sicknesses are temporary. In our world, when we catch a cold, we know it will pass in a week. When we develop an infection, we know antibiotics will handle it. When we feel something stranger than the ordinary, we know we can consult professionals who will identify what is happening and treat it accordingly. Medieval people had none of this certainty. When they became ill, they simply did not know what was wrong, whether it would improve or whether it would kill them. They watched their own symptoms with a mixture of resignation and hope, and they waited to see what would happen next. The most common medieval illnesses were the ones we would now consider minor. Colds, coughs, fevers, sore throats, stomach upsets, and skin infections were part of ordinary life. But because medieval people had weaker immune systems from chronic malnutrition, because they lived in close proximity to animals and to each other, and because they had no way to interrupt the natural progression of most infections, even these ordinary illnesses could become serious. A cold that lingered for weeks could turn into pneumonia. A skin cut that got infected could turn into blood poisoning. A stomach illness that would clear up in 3 days for a modern person could turn into severe dehydration and death for a medieval child. Fever was perhaps the most familiar medieval symptom and the one that carried the most fear. Because medieval people did not understand what caused fevers, they treated the fever itself as the illness. And fevers came from everything, from infected wounds, from respiratory illnesses, from food-borne sickness, from childbirth complications, from dozens of infectious diseases that circulated freely through medieval populations. When a person became feverish, the family watched carefully. They noted whether the fever came in cycles, which suggested certain illnesses. They noted whether it was accompanied by rashes, which suggested others. They noted whether the person could still take fluids, whether they were coherent, whether they were sweating. And they waited. The waiting was, in some ways, the worst part. Medieval families sat beside sick relatives for days and sometimes weeks, offering the small comforts they had, cool cloths for the forehead, sips of water or broth, whispered prayers, and mostly presents. There was nothing else to do. There was no hospital in the modern sense to which the person could be taken. There was no doctor with reliable treatments who could be called. There were folk healers, herbalists, and occasionally physicians for the wealthy, but their interventions were often as likely to harm as to help. So the family waited, and the fever ran its course, and either the person recovered or they did not. Children were particularly vulnerable. Medieval infant mortality was staggering by modern standards, with perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of children dying before their 5th birthday. Every family knew this loss. Every mother had held a small body that had grown cold. Every father had dug a small grave. This was not an unusual tragedy. It was an expected part of parenthood. Medieval people did not respond to this by loving their children less. They loved them intensely, but they also lived with the constant knowledge that any illness might take them, and they braced themselves accordingly. When a child developed a fever, the family prepared for both outcomes. Prayers were offered, neighbours were informed, and life continued around the sickbed, because life had to continue. Beyond the ordinary illnesses, medieval people faced the great epidemic diseases that periodically swept through their world. The most famous of these was the plague, which arrived in the 14th century and killed a substantial portion of the population of Europe within a few years. But plague was not the only epidemic threat. Smallpox, measles, typhus, dysentery, influenza, and various fevers all travelled through medieval populations with regularity. Some killed quickly. Others left survivors permanently marked, with scars, weaknesses, or disabilities that lasted the rest of their lives. Smallpox in particular left its mark on medieval faces. The disease produced pustules across the entire body, especially the face, and those who survived it were often left with pitted scarring that could be mild or severe. A face heavily marked by smallpox scars was not unusual in medieval life. It was a visible sign that the person had faced the disease and won, and while it was not considered attractive, it was also not particularly stigmatized. Everyone knew someone with smallpox scars. Many people had them themselves. It was simply another way that illness wrote itself onto the medieval body. Then there were the chronic illnesses that lingered without ever fully resolving. Tuberculosis, called consumption because it seemed to consume its victims from within, killed people slowly over months or years. The person coughed. They grew thinner. Their skin took on a pale, translucent quality. They coughed blood eventually, and they weakened until they could no longer work, and then they died, sometimes surrounded by family, sometimes alone in a corner of a home where they had been quietly wasting away. Everyone knew what consumption looked like. Everyone dreaded it. And it was common. Parasites were another chronic burden. Intestinal worms of various kinds were nearly universal in medieval populations, particularly in areas where sanitation was poor, which was most areas. Children in particular carried heavy parasitic loads that contributed to their malnutrition, their slow growth, and their general lack of vitality. The signs were familiar: pot bellies on thin bodies, chronic itching around certain areas, occasional visible worms in the stool. Medieval people knew what worms were and knew they were unwelcome, but they had no effective way to eliminate them, and so they simply lived with them. Adults reduced their parasite loads through various herbal remedies that sometimes worked, but reinfection was constant, and most people carried some parasitic burden throughout their lives. Skin conditions of all kinds were widespread. Lice were nearly universal, in the hair, in the clothing, in the beds. Fleas were constant companions, particularly in warmer months. Scabies, ringworm, various fungal infections, and dozens of other skin problems affected medieval populations in ways that produced constant low-grade itching, discomfort, and occasional serious infections. People scratched themselves throughout the day without any embarrassment, because everyone scratched. Clothing carried its own inhabitants. Beds carried theirs. The medieval body was not alone in itself. It was a shared environment. Now, medieval medicine did exist, though it was a strange mixture of accumulated folk wisdom, classical theories inherited from the Greek and Roman worlds, religious frameworks, and outright guesswork. The dominant medical theory was based on the four humours, a Greek idea that had been elaborated over centuries. According to this theory, the body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health depended on their balance. Illness was understood as an imbalance of these humours, and treatment aimed to restore the balance through various methods. Bloodletting was the most famous of these treatments. If a person had too much blood, the theory went, the solution was to remove some. Blood was drawn from various sites depending on the illness, using small blades or leeches. The practice was widespread, applied to everything from fevers to headaches to melancholy. It rarely helped, and often weakened patients further, but it was so deeply established that people expected it, sought it out, and felt reassured when they received it. The barber surgeons who performed bloodletting were respected professionals in medieval society, and their striped poles, red and white for blood and bandages, became such a familiar symbol that we still see them outside barbershops today. Herbal medicine was more genuinely useful, though its effectiveness was inconsistent. Medieval herbalists knew which plants could reduce pain, which could induce sleep, which could ease digestion, and which could treat skin conditions. Willow bark for pain and fever, certain mints for stomach troubles, garlic and onions for various infections, chamomile for calming. These were real medicines with real effects, even though the theories behind them were often wrong. When a medieval person took a preparation that worked, it worked whether or not the reasoning behind it made sense. Prayer and religious intervention were considered legitimate medical treatments, deeply intertwined with physical remedies. A person who was ill would receive both herbal treatments and prayers, both bloodletting and pilgrimages to shrines. Saints were petitioned for specific ailments. Relics were touched or held near sick people. Holy water was drunk. Confession was made in case the illness was somehow related to sin. All of this was understood as part of comprehensive care. The line we now draw between medicine and religion did not exist in the medieval world. The body and the soul were treated together because they were understood as inseparable. And through all of this, illness was integrated into daily life in ways that would shock a modern person. Sick people were rarely isolated in the way we would isolate them today, unless they had a disease so obviously contagious and dangerous that quarantine was enforced, as sometimes happened during plague outbreaks. In ordinary illness, the sick person stayed in the household, sharing space, sharing air, sharing food, and often sharing beds with healthy family members. This is one reason illnesses spread so easily and so completely. It is also a reflection of a world in which separation from family during suffering was almost unthinkable. The sick person kept doing what they could. If they could still walk, they walked. If they could still work with their hands, they worked. Only when they became truly unable to function did they take to bed, and even then, they got up when possible, contributed what they could, and rejoined ordinary life as soon as their strength permitted. Recovery was not a distinct phase, it was a gradual re-entry into normal labour, with the person doing more each day as they were able. Complete rest, the kind we now consider essential to healing, was largely unavailable to medieval people. They healed while working, because they had no other choice. Let us turn now to something that is perhaps the most striking and the most difficult to sit with quietly, which is the medieval relationship with death. Because in the medieval world, death was not the distant, medicalised, hidden event that it has become in our own time. It was close. It was familiar. It was woven into daily life in ways that shaped how people understood their own bodies, their own suffering, and their own place in the world. And to understand medieval pain fully, we have to understand that it lived alongside death constantly, and that this proximity changed everything about how pain itself was experienced. Medieval people saw death often. They saw it in their families, in their villages, in their travels, in their churches. Children died. Mothers died in childbirth. Fathers died from accidents, illnesses, and injuries. Old people died at what we would now consider middle age. Neighbours died. Animals died and were slaughtered in full view of the household. Death was not something that happened in a hospital or a hospice, tucked away behind curtains and managed by professionals. It happened in the same room where the family lived, cooked, slept, and worked. It happened on a bed of straw beside the fire. It happened in a chair by the window. It happened in the field sometimes, when someone collapsed at work and did not get up again. Because of this constant proximity, medieval people had a different relationship with their own mortality than modern people do. They did not expect to live long lives. They hoped, of course, but the hope was tempered by realism. A person who had reached 50 had already outlived most of their contemporaries. A person who reached 70 was considered remarkable, a rarity, someone who had been unusually fortunate or unusually blessed. Most people expected to die considerably younger, and they lived their lives with this expectation quietly present in the background of every decision. This did not make medieval people morbid. On the contrary, in many ways it made them more capable of accepting the ordinary pains of daily life, because they understood those pains within a larger framework. Every ache was a reminder that the body was still working. Every illness was a reminder that recovery was possible, but not guaranteed. Every day of continued life was in some sense a small gift, though not one that was necessarily received with visible gratitude. It was received simply, without commentary, and used to do the work that needed to be done. The medieval attitude towards suffering was also shaped by religion in ways that are difficult to fully translate into modern terms. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, Christianity provided the framework through which physical experience was understood. Pain was not meaningless. Pain was often interpreted as spiritually significant, as a test, as a discipline. as a way of drawing closer to a suffering God, as a preparation for the eternal life that would follow this brief and difficult earthly existence. This did not make pain less painful, but it made pain more bearable because it was situated within a story that gave it purpose. A medieval peasant with an aching back and swollen hands could, if they chose, understand their labour as a form of devotion. Their suffering could be offered up in the language of medieval piety, joined to the sufferings of Christ, given meaning through faith. A woman enduring the physical toll of repeated childbirth could see her pain as a share in the sacred work of bringing new life into the world. A person dying slowly of consumption could prepare their soul, make their confession, receive the last rites, and pass from this life with the belief that a better one awaited. None of this eliminated the pain, but it reframed it. It gave it a shape and a direction. It made pain feel less like an insult and more like a passage. This religious framework also shaped how people cared for one another. The sick were visited not just out of familial love, but out of religious duty. The dying were attended not just by family, but often by priests, neighbours, and members of the community who understood their presence as a spiritual obligation. Charitable care of the sick was considered one of the highest forms of Christian practice. Monasteries operated hospitals and hospices in many regions. Confraternities, which were religious brotherhoods and sisterhoods, dedicated themselves to caring for the dying, arranging their funerals, and praying for their souls after death. Even the poorest medieval person at the moment of their final illness could expect to be surrounded by human presence in ways that many modern people, dying alone in hospital rooms, might envy. Death itself in the medieval world was a communal event. When a person began to die, the household gathered. Neighbours were called. A priest was summoned if possible to administer the last sacraments, which included confession, communion, and the anointing of the sick. These rituals were not empty formalities. They were experienced as genuinely transformative, as spiritual preparation for the journey ahead. The dying person, if conscious, was expected to make peace with God, forgive those who had wronged them, ask forgiveness of those they had wronged, and settle any remaining earthly matters. This process could take hours or days, and it was witnessed by everyone in the room. The physical experience of dying in the medieval world was rarely peaceful in the modern sense. Pain relief was minimal. A dying person often experienced the full sensations of whatever was killing them, whether it was infection, injury, illness, or simple old age. What softened the experience was not medication, but presence. The room was full. Familiar faces surrounded the bed. Voices spoke gentle words. Prayers were murmured continuously. Candles were lit. The person did not die alone, and this was considered essential. To die alone was a genuine tragedy, and considerable effort was made to ensure that no one had to face death in isolation if it could be avoided. After death, the body remained in the home for a period, usually a day or two, depending on custom and season. Neighbours came to view the body, to pay respects, to sit with the family in their grief. Washing and preparation of the body was often done by women in the community who knew this work, who had done it many times before, who moved with the quiet competence of long practice. The body was dressed in whatever clean clothing was available. Hands were folded. Sometimes a coin was placed in the mouth or on the eyes. Sometimes flowers or herbs were arranged around the body. The room in which the body lay became a place of visitation, of prayer, of memory, and of quiet mourning that was allowed to be expressed openly because everyone understood what had happened. The funeral itself involved the community. The body was carried, sometimes over considerable distances, to the church for the funeral service and then to the burial ground. The procession was often accompanied by the ringing of church bells, which announced the death to the entire parish. Everyone who heard the bells knew that a soul had passed, and many would pause in their work to offer a quick prayer for the dead. The burial was witnessed by family, friends, and neighbours. Sometimes food was shared afterward, a small meal that brought people together in the aftermath of grief. And then life continued, because it had to. But here is what is perhaps most striking about the medieval relationship with death, and what returns us most clearly to our theme of pain. Because death was so present, because it was witnessed so often, because it was ritualized and framed and made meaningful, medieval people were less afraid of it in certain ways than we are. Not because they wanted to die, they wanted to live deeply, as much as anyone always has, but because they had seen death many times, and they had seen that it could be met with dignity, with faith, with the presence of loved ones, they did not carry the specific modern terror of dying that comes from having never witnessed it up close. This shaped how they experienced pain. A person who does not fear death fears pain less, in a strange way, because the ultimate consequence of severe pain, the thing that pain is warning about at its deepest levels, is often death. And if death is not seen as a catastrophic ending, but as a transition, however difficult, then pain loses some of its terror. It becomes something that can be endured, because whatever it might lead to has already been considered, prepared for, and integrated into the person's understanding of their life. This is not to say medieval people were cheerful in the face of suffering. They were not. They wept when they were bereaved. They cried out in genuine agony when they were in severe pain. They grieved deeply for lost children, lost spouses, lost parents. They were human, entirely human, and their emotions were as real and as intense as any human emotions have ever been. But their emotional responses were embedded in a framework that gave pain and death a place, a shape, a meaning. They did not experience these things as random catastrophes disrupting an otherwise pleasant existence. They experienced them as part of the fabric of what it meant to be alive, and so, when we look back at medieval life and marvel at how much pain people endured, we should perhaps be careful about assuming that they experienced this pain exactly as we would. The pain was real. The physical sensations were the same as ours would be. But the context surrounding the pain was profoundly different, and context shapes experience in ways that are difficult to measure. A modern person suddenly transported into a medieval body, feeling all the aches, hungers, fevers and injuries of that life, would likely find it unbearable, not just because of the physical suffering, but because of the meaninglessness of that suffering in a modern framework. A medieval person feeling those same things understood them differently, and this understanding was itself a kind of medicine, however imperfect. There is something worth sitting with here, quietly, as you drift towards sleep. Something about the way meaning can transform suffering, even without changing its physical reality. Medieval people had almost none of the material comforts we take for granted, and their bodies paid a heavy price for the world they lived in. But they had something that we, in our comfort, have sometimes lost, which is a sense that pain has a place in life, that it belongs, that it is not a scandal or an outrage, but simply part of what a body does in a demanding world. Whether they were right or wrong about the sources of meaning they found, they were undeniably better at living with pain than most of us have ever needed to be. We have wandered together through many rooms of the medieval body, and now, as our journey draws toward its quiet ending, let us pause in a final space. Let us look at what all of this pain, all of this endurance, all of this quiet daily acceptance ultimately meant. Because the medieval world was not just a catalogue of aches, it was a whole way of being human, and the pain that ran through it was inseparable from the meaning that surrounded it. To understand medieval life fully is to understand that pain was not the enemy of that life. Pain was the texture of that life, woven so tightly into every hour that removing it would have unravelled the whole fabric. Consider, for a moment, what a medieval body looked like at the end of a long life. Imagine a woman in her 60s, which was old age in medieval terms, sitting near the fire in the evening with the household gathered around her. Her hands resting in her lap are gnarled and worn. The knuckles are enlarged from decades of work. The fingers curl slightly, unable to fully straighten anymore. The skin is thin and marked with countless small scars, some deep, some faint, each one a memory of a moment when the skin met something sharp. Her nails are ridged and yellow, thickened from years of exposure to weather, water and work. Her back is bent, not sharply but noticeably, from the many years of carrying, bending and lifting. Her shoulders slope forward in a way that no modern posture would allow. Her neck no longer turns fully to either side, and when she wants to look at someone, she turns her whole body slightly. Her knees, when she rises from the fire to walk to bed, take a moment to negotiate with gravity, and she leans on a stick or a shoulder to make the transition smoother. Her feet, in their patched shoes, have widened and hardened over decades of walking on uneven ground. Her toes overlap slightly, misaligned from the poor fit of every shoe she has ever worn. Her face carries its own record. The skin is weathered from a lifetime of sun and wind and cold. Lines have settled deeply around her eyes and mouth, some from laughter, some from squinting, some from the pain of dozens of small illnesses over the years. Her teeth, what remains of them, are worn down to stubs or missing entirely. Her jaw has adjusted around the gaps, and when she speaks, her voice comes out slightly muffled, adapted to the mouth she has now, rather than the mouth she was born with. Her eyes are dim, having spent thousands of evenings squinting at fine work by the light of a single candle. She sees well enough to know the shapes of her family in the firelight, but she has stopped trying to do delicate work with her hands. And yet, this woman is not tragic. She is not to be pitied in the way we might instinctively pity her. She has lived. She has lived a full medieval life. She has raised children, some of whom survived and some of whom did not. She has buried a husband and perhaps a second one. She has worked the fields, tended the animals, spun the wool, baked the bread, nursed the sick and comforted the dying. She has been useful, thoroughly useful, for decade after decade, and in a world that measured a person's worth largely by their usefulness. She has been a success. Her pains are not failures, her pains are certificates. Her body is a document, written in aches and scars and adjustments, that records everything she has done and everything she has survived. Around her, the household continues. Younger family members are doing their evening tasks. A daughter is spinning by the fire, her wrists already showing the familiar signs of that work. A grandson is mending a tool, his small hands learning the motions that will shape him for the rest of his life. A great-grandchild, still small, is sitting on the floor watching the flames and eating a piece of bread. The old woman watches them all, and she knows what awaits them. She knows the aches they will develop, the illnesses they will face, the losses they will endure. She does not tell them these things directly. She simply passes on what she can. The small wisdoms of adaptation, the little ways of moving that protect a knee or ease a shoulder, the recipes and the prayers and the practical knowledge that make medieval life livable. This is what pain in the medieval world produced. Not just suffering, but continuity. Not just wear, but wisdom. Not just endurance, but a whole culture of quiet mutual understanding among people who all shared the same essential physical experience. Everyone hurt. Everyone knew that everyone hurt. And within that shared knowledge, a certain kind of solidarity existed that we, in our comfort and our privacy, sometimes struggle to reproduce. Modern people often ask when they learn about medieval life how anyone could have lived that way. The question assumes that the medieval experience was continuously terrible, that people must have been miserable, that their lives must have been dominated by suffering. But this is not how the people who lived those lives would have described them. They would have described their lives, if asked, as ordinary. They would have spoken of their families, their work, their faith, their small pleasures, their fears and their hopes. They would have mentioned the pain only if pressed, and even then they would have spoken of it briefly, matter-of-factly, without the dramatic weight we might expect. Because pain for them was not the story. Pain was the background against which the story unfolded. The story was everything else. It was the moment when a mother held a newborn who survived. It was the harvest that came in successfully after a good summer. It was the wedding celebration where the whole village gathered and danced. It was the priest chanting familiar words that had been chanted for centuries. It was the smell of bread baking, the sound of children laughing, the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the taste of the first fresh vegetables of spring. It was the feeling of finishing a long day and knowing that you had done what needed to be done. It was the quiet satisfaction of a task completed, a promise kept, a family fed. Medieval people knew these joys too. Their lives were not only pain. They loved, they laughed, they celebrated, they told stories, they played games, they sang songs, they fell in love, they raised children, they built friendships, they cared for one another. All of this happened alongside the pain, not despite it. The pain was one thread in a much larger tapestry, and while it was a heavy thread, it was not the only one. The tapestry itself, seen from a distance, was rich and complex and human. This is perhaps the most important thing to carry away from our long journey together tonight. That pain, however much of it there was, did not define medieval life. Medieval life was defined by everything that people did while in pain, by the labour that produced the food that fed the villagers, by the love that raised the children who became the next generation, by the faith that gave meaning to suffering and death, by the communities that held people together through everything they faced. Pain was the medium through which medieval life was conducted, but the life itself was more than the pain. And so, as you lie there in your bed, wherever you are in the world, in whatever kind of room or apartment or house, on whatever kind of mattress with whatever kind of blanket, consider for a moment what you have that they did not. You have warmth that reliably surrounds you, without your having to gather wood or tend a fire. You have food that is available whenever you want it, in quantities that would astonish anyone from any earlier century. You have clean water flowing from taps. You have shoes that fit and clothes that are soft. You have medicines that can reduce pain, cure infections, and manage the ordinary aches of daily life. You have doctors who can diagnose what is wrong with you and treatments that actually work. You have the expectation of a long life and the general absence of the fear that any small illness might kill you. You have all of this, and you can feel it now, gently, as you settle deeper into your bed. Notice the softness beneath you. Notice the warmth around you. Notice the absence of the aches that would have been there if you had lived 700 years ago and done the work of an ordinary person. Notice that your teeth, whatever their condition, are probably not throbbing right now. Notice that your stomach is probably not empty in the deep hollow way that medieval stomachs so often were. Notice that your feet are probably not raw with blisters, that your hands are probably not scarred with a lifetime of cuts, that your back can probably still bend without protest. These are gifts, enormous quiet gifts, given to you by centuries of human progress that you did not personally earn, but that you get to inhabit anyway. Medieval people would have wept to have what you have, and they would have used it not to escape all pain, because pain is part of being human, but to reduce the pointless kinds of pain, the kinds that came from cold and hunger and untreated infections and preventable illnesses. Those pains have largely been removed from your life. What remains is the deeper, quieter pain of being a human being at all, the pains that no amount of progress will ever fully eliminate, the pains that connect you to every human who has ever lived. And so tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself feel gratitude for the softness of your world. Let yourself feel quiet respect for the people who lived through so much more than you will ever have to face. Let yourself feel the strange peace that comes from understanding that your ordinary comforts are the treasures of history, gathered slowly and often at great cost, and now resting around you as if they had always been there. The medieval world is far behind us now. Its pains are silent, its people are gone, but their endurance, their quiet dignity, their capacity to live full lives inside difficult bodies remains as a kind of quiet teacher. They lived, they loved, they worked, they hurt, they died, and somehow, through all of it, they built the world that eventually became ours. Sleep well tonight. sleep gently. And when you wake in the morning, in your warm room, with your comfortable bed, and your body that does not know most of the pains we have discussed, remember for just a moment that this ordinary morning of yours would have been, to a medieval person, a small and beautiful miracle. Good night, and thank you for walking with me through this long and quiet journey. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and letting me know in the comments what you would like to explore next. Until then, rest well, and may your dreams be soft. Peace.